open in prayer, and then we'll get started. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this evening. I thank you for the fact that we're all in good moods, and Lord, I just pray that my studies I'll be able to communicate them effectively, and Lord, that you'll use these next couple hours to get us to think deeper and clearer, and all for the purpose of serving you. So I just want to lift this class up. In Christ's name, amen. Amen. Very good. Sometimes I feel like I'm saying the same thing every time I open in prayer. So, thank you for the class, bless the students, things like that. But that's okay, right?
Yes. That's right. Yeah.
So
that's what you're doing.
That's right. That's right. So last week, boy, we covered a lot, didn't we? A lot of content, a lot of things you guys had to write down. This week, we're going to get to logic. We got to get to logic because that was part of your reading, and argumentation. So I want to get to that. That'll be in the second half. I want to talk about the divisions, philosophy, and the ways in which it's been broken down or broken up in the past into more manageable components. But as a review from last week, I just wanted to cover a few things that won't take too long. The history of philosophy, it's been said, has been the attempt to answer questions one of two ways. Either questions about God or to answer questions without God. And that's, in a nutshell, the history of philosophy. To answer questions about God or to answer ultimate questions without God. That covers anything we can ask, doesn't it? We also said that the three major concerns, and this is sort of in layman's terms, we said the three major concerns last week, and I think I brushed over it, so you might not have even remember or jotted it down, were that concern number one, how the world holds together. How does the world hang together? Concern number two, how do we justify our beliefs? And concern number three, how do we therefore live in light of 1 and 2? And that's sort of our three categories. So tonight I want to cover these divisions of philosophy. And like I said, that will be how do we therefore live in light of thinking about and answering how is it that the world holds together, why does it hold together, etc. Right. Why do we believe what we do, and can we justify what we do believe? So, and listen, again, if you want questions, if you want to ask questions, just go ahead and raise your hand, and then try to ask the question. I was hearing some audio, and then you can't hear the students, so I want to repeat what you said. So if you make it in manageable bites, then I can repeat it, so future audiences can hear the question. Make sense? It would be nice if we had maybe mics that could go on and off when someone asks a question. We wouldn't want the mics on all the time, because then we'd have to hear the rumbling back there, especially that last row. Now we said that philosophy has a strange reputation, right? And there were a couple reasons we gave for that. One is that it doesn't seem to hold a high place of importance in the educational system until you get to college. And then even at college, it doesn't hold a high place of importance. Nowadays it's all about the STEM, the STEM fields, right? Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. That's where money's made. That's where people, want to study. They can go out and get a job right away. So in
it also said, Joe, that in a lot of universities, philosophy has kind of knocked out theology for what its intent was. It's kind of like theology.
Oh, well, that is true. That is a secondary issue, that philosophy has supplanted theology.
In a lot of
That's a whole nother topic, sort of. But it's that it's not viewed, philosophy isn't viewed as that important. And a lot of it has to do with today's view of epistemology. What's knowledge? How do we gain knowledge? What kind of knowledge can we trust? And so we have more of a scientific epistemology. And philosophy doesn't deal with the data and the facts in that way. So if you can't empirically verify something, then you can't believe that hold that it's true, right? Now you're venturing over into what the culture calls faith, which is a misdefinition, but that's what they call it, faith. If you can't verify it, but you believe it anyways, that takes faith. So part of the reason for the bad reputation is the lack of importance that it holds in educating our youth. It would be nice if it was taught in high school, the categories and logic and argumentation. And I know that within the circles of homeschooling, it's taught. There's a real push for classical education, the trivium, the quadrivium, rhetoric, grammar, logic. There's a study of Latin, root language Latin, things like that. So, and you're aware of that. You're familiar with that, right,
Christian
Diane?
schools are doing that too.
Are they teaching logic?
Yes. Some, I mean.
Well, that's good to hear. That's good to hear. So those are some of the reasons. Then we said last week that in order to know something, you could know it or learn about it in 4 different ways. We said you can describe it or define it, describe it, compare and contrast it, or experience it. We spent the bulk of that time not on the definition, but on the description. We'll get to the definition shortly. But in describing it, we said that philosophy was concerned with how to think about the facts, how to think about the data, how to think about the methods that were used to gather the data. Philosophy was concerned with clarity of terms, clarity of definition, clarity of concepts. We said that philosophy was a second-order discipline as opposed to a first-order discipline like the sciences, like history, okay, even like several fields of study in the humanities or liberal arts. You have sociology and anthropology and things like that. Those are first-order disciplines. Philosophy, being a second-order discipline, thinks about how we're to think about the information that's learned in those first-order disciplines. We said philosophy was concerned with eliminating ambiguities, eliminating vagueness. We said philosophy was concerned with foundational questions, or the big questions, the questions that have been asked for the past, for all of human history. Well, what's out there? Why am I here? Is there a God? Things like that. Then we moved on to comparing and contrasting as a method of knowing what something is. And what did we compare and contrast philosophy with? We compared it and contrasted it with 3 things. And we do that to highlight the similarities and then point out the differences. Religion was one, right? Religion and philosophy in gaining knowledge, answering questions. We said that philosophy uses reason, right? The human ability to reason, and religion relies more on revelation to fill the knowledge gaps. And you could pick any religion you want. They all rely on some type of revelation. We said that we compared and contrast philosophy with science, right? Again, to gather or answer questions, science handles it empirically, right? Through the scientific method, in the lab, through testing, etc., and philosophy, again, through the use of reason and our ability to be rational. And then we also said art. That art it deals with ultimate questions aesthetically through the artistic medium of choice. Very subjective there, right? And we'll talk about aesthetics and the objective nature of them also down the road. We talked about why. Why do we add this? Why is this class part of classes that
Makes
deal
you
with
think.
theology,
Makes you think.
evangelism? Yeah, makes you think, right?
That's what you said.
Well, we're developing a skill. We want to develop a skill. We can all get better. We can all be better thinkers. We said we want to develop a philosophical mindset, right? Which essentially means to make you think and think better. We said to live and examine life. We said that we could help others. If we do acquire a skill or enhance our abilities, we can help those around us. How often do people come to us with questions about anything, really? It helps us to evaluate and construct arguments. You can't be persuasive if you can't argue properly. And I don't mean argue bantering back and forth. You guys already realized that if you read. For sure. You have to be able to construct arguments, evaluate arguments. And we're going to get to that too, probably next week, the evaluating part. When I read an article, when I watch TV and see a commercial, when I watch the news, you're being bombarded with arguments. A commercial tries to make a case for why you need that particular product. So we face arguments all the time. Driving down the freeway, you see the billboards, those are little arguments. And so we have to be able to evaluate them. Did you have a question? No? Oh, I thought you did. Okay. Okay. So studying philosophy helps us refine our worldview. It helps us have a more coherent and comprehensive worldview. It gives us categories, and then it keeps us organized mentally, so to speak. Sort of in the same way that the study of theology does. Theology has categories, right? Study of God, study of Jesus Christ, study of the Holy Spirit, study of the end times, things like that, study of man, etc. So it gives us categories. And then I said it was also practical for decision making. Helps us to think about issues that we may be faced with. We may have already been faced with some of them, maybe end-of-life issues for parents or loved ones or what have you. Other ethical issues. There's all kinds of ethical issues that many times are settled at the ballot box, too. And then we refined it even further, and we said for believers specifically. So not only is the study of philosophy good for anybody, and then specifically for believers, there's an extra added emphasis or motivation. One is that, I think we are, it's incumbent upon us, part of the responsibility of being a follower of Christ is to think critically. When Jesus said that the greatest commandment, when he was asked by the Pharisees, what is the greatest commandment? They tried to trap him. And he said it was to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. So being a sloppy thinker isn't loving God with your mind. It's not honoring. Now, specifically, we're required to examine everything. Examine everything. Philosophy, there's no field of study that philosophy doesn't examine. We're told to handle the word accurately. That's 2 Timothy 2:15. Present yourselves to God as a worker who's approved, someone who's diligent. Why is that? Why do we need to work at it to handle accurately? Not to be flippant in our use and just pick verses out and throw them out at people like you see on, like you might see on television or something. I see a lot of sloppy handling of God's word. We're not supposed to just proof text that way and take one verse out of context without knowing what the paragraph or the chapter says. But people do it all the time. That's not handling accurately. We need to do it so we're not ashamed. Think about that. So we're not ashamed.
When you feel confident about what you're talking about,
Makes a huge difference.
it's easier to talk about.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Are you saying that you can't use any scripture out of context?
Yeah.
Like
We
2
sh- we-
Timothy 1:7, God is not a spirit of fear, but of love and a sound mind?
I'm not saying that we can't use verses. I'm saying we shouldn't use any of them out of their context or their specific meaning, what was intended by the writer. But we shouldn't do that with any literature. We should want to seek for the meaning that the author intended.
Okay.
Okay, think of this. Right now, our president nominated a person to sit as a justice on the Supreme Court. So people want to know, what is that person's philosophy in regards to the Constitution and how they rule? In what regard do they view precedent and things like that? I was having a discussion with an acquaintance of mine who was against any justice because of who the president was. Okay, that right there is a logical fallacy. I completely understand people's feelings towards the president, but if he nominates somebody who holds the Constitution in high regard, and is going to, and his history as a judge reflects the fact that he is careful about passing judgments that uphold the Constitution. That is the number one responsibility of a Supreme Court justice. I presented a quote that I knew from Sonia Sotomayor, who is one of the justices. And in her opening statement, when she was nominated, she even said the number one responsibility of a Supreme Court justice is to uphold the Constitution. Well, here's the thing. When you say that, you ask, what then does the Constitution mean? And so we're having this debate over, is the Constitution pliable? Is it a living document? If it is, then you can make it say whatever you want. But if it's not, then you want to read it in its context and discover what it is that the authors meant by what they wrote. And that's exactly how we should handle the Bible also. So to answer your question, am I saying we should never take Scripture out of context? I'm not sure that that's what you meant or meant to ask. Because, yes, I'm against always, every time, taking Scripture out of context. I think you meant, does that mean we can't use a Bible verse on its own? No, we can, as long as we're using it for the purpose for which it was intended. Now, does that make sense? So anyways, as far as why to study philosophy, as a follower of Christ, I already said two things. One, we should examine everything carefully, and that we should handle accurately and interpret honestly and accurately. And then three is to refute arguments. We are supposed to refute arguments. But you can't refute arguments unless you're adept at understanding the arguments that's being made. And then we're supposed to stand against error. So there's pulpits all over the country with people in them that preach error. And we are responsible. We are individually responsible, by the way. Yes, are church leaders responsible? They're supposed to look over the flock? Absolutely. But that doesn't absolve a member of the flock from being taken in by goofy teaching and false teaching. So I think the overarching point that was made last week, was to give a defense, right? I was basically giving a defense for why we're here, why we study philosophy, why it's important, and how, in particular, it could and would benefit anybody, how it could and would benefit Christians, and if that's the case, it would in turn benefit the church. So if having a philosophical mindset results in approaching life with the attitude that it is healthy to examine our beliefs, that it's healthy to search for truth, that it's healthy to evaluate ideas and their meanings, then we should all strive to cultivate this mindset. We will be the beneficiaries, for sure, and so will those that we come in contact with, so will those of our loved ones, our family, and friends. We will improve and here's some theological terms, we will improve our hermeneutic, which I just got done talking about. Hermeneutic, the art. Improves our evangelism. Paul says that you gain more confidence. When you gain more confidence and you're more sure of what you believe and are convinced that it's true, and then you couple that with the command to lovingly share with our neighbors. Who's our neighbor? Anybody? Anybody? Not obnoxiously. I don't know anybody standing on a street corner and screaming at people about having to repent or, burn in hell, that type of thing. I don't know. Do you guys know it? Have you heard of stories where someone just stops in their tracks and then just gives their life to the Lord because of that? I haven't. I don't know. Maybe it has happened. But in today's day and age, I think there may have been a context in the past where there was more of a familiarity. There was sort of this common cultural understanding of the Judeo-Christian message, whether someone believed or not. They could articulate it, perhaps even better than most of believers today, because that was just the cultural context in which they grew up. It may have worked then, when they talk about fire and brimstone type messages, the tent meetings and things like that of the 19th century. Sure, there was conviction and a lot of, I think, conversion then.
I was there.
You were there in the 1800s?
No, not the 1800s, but they did do that, brimstone. And
It was still going on.
churches.
Yeah. In certain parts of the country and things like that.
Our evangelism teams go out and they sit at a table. It's a little different.
That's different.
But they bring people come to them.
Well, there's an evangelism
That's
team
the
that,
Lord.
that meets at Norco College or different colleges. Lenny Esposito, if you're in Thursday night's class on church history, he's taken many teams. They've gone to Salt Lake City and in the Mormon territory. They've gone to UC Berkeley.
But they're not telling people they're going to hell.
No. It's conversational.
It's assumed, though.
Why do you believe what you believe? Right? Why do you believe? You strike up a conversation, and like you said, maybe you have a table. Because I know on colleges now they have free speech zones.
Yes.
You can't just run all over anywhere. So you have to go to that area, right? So, and there are people looking for maybe a battle, right? And then that's where you just keep your wits about you. But you always want to do it, with gentleness and respect. That's how we always want to present ourselves. So our hermeneutic, our evangelism, our apologetic, with gentleness and respect. Defense, our defense. Our response, polemics, which is really the art of engaging in dispute within, sort of maybe within the walls of the church. So if we view apologetics as talking with the rest of the world, and then we view polemics as talking with those within the body. And then theology overall. And I talked about this last week, and we will see this, how much of the terminology that we use to define theological disputes and have theological descriptions, the wording and terminology comes right out of philosophy, because philosophy has terminology that's very precise. So you want to be very precise when you talk about things like the Trinity or the humanity of Christ, the dual nature of Christ, and things like that. So there are ways that we do that too. So now let's talk about the divisions of philosophy, because our reading beginning from here on out will start to, in fact, our next chapters will be a division. So the study of philosophy covers, more than 2,500 years. 2,500 years of thought, and that includes questions on almost every subject that you could think of. So to help us absorb what it is that we're going to be reading, the things that we're talking about, we want to break up this 2,500 years of broad philosophical thinking into more manageable categories. So how are we going to do that? Well, there's different ways of doing it. So I'll talk about a couple, and then we'll land on the one that the book focuses on, the one that's more customarily done in the classroom. Okay, so there's more than one way to divide it, but let's talk about the historical approach. So there is a way to do it called the historical approach. The historical approach studies the development of ideas as they evolved. Hence, historical. The study of the development of the ideas as they evolved. It examines the philosophers and their ideas in the context of their time period. So when we divide it this way, it's usually broken into four main periods. So here's the historical approach, and here's the sort of the four epochs, the four time periods. Ancient philosophy, that's our first time period. That goes and begins all the way back around 600 BC up to about 400 AD. And if I was in a secular college, I would say current era, right? CE. So 600 BC to 400 AD, 1,000 years, ancient philosophy. This covers the beginning of what we know as Western philosophy. It covers the classical Greek and Roman thinkers, the pre-Socratics, those who had thoughts, not necessarily lived before Socrates, because some lived during the time that Socrates lived, but the pre-Socratics had more to do with ideas that preceded Socrates' thinking. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, all came from this period. The three most important thinkers of ancient philosophy. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these categories. So that's ancient philosophy. The medieval period. The medieval period is where the church was most dominant in Western philosophy. You had thinkers like Augustine, Aquinas, Anselm. In this time period, this is from about 400 AD to 1400, just before the scientific revolution. 400 to 1400. Yes. Now, in this period, philosophers used their craft as a way of expressing their Christian understanding of the world. It's where you, you had some good arguments presented that are used to this day for the existence of God. Anyways, there was a lot of time to sit around and think, so a lot of important thinkers in this medieval period.
Lenny Esposito said that the Christian era, or hopefully I'm getting this right, said that they were basically atheists who were countering the theist or the polytheistic environment.
So, okay, let me get this on.
Okay.
Who were the atheists?
The Christians were, because they were against the polytheism.
Oh, no, I know what you're talking about. Okay.
During what time?
The patristics, right in the 2nd century. Okay, so in the 2nd century, late 1st century, okay, 2nd century, when the church really spread throughout the Roman Empire, the accusation against Christians were, look at them, they're atheists because they didn't hold to the polytheistic belief system that was throughout the Roman Empire. They rejected all of that. They were monotheists. So it was a false charge, but it was, it was basically rhetoric. They were trying to castigate them and marginalize them as if they weren't marginalized enough already. So it wasn't that they were atheists, it was that they were accused of being atheists for the fact that they rejected the gods of the day.
Exactly.
Okay. So we got that clear. I think I did that right.
You did.
I better check with Lenny.
But that was not the period.
That's not the medieval period.
Okay.
Medieval period, the Roman Empire converted.
The next. Oh,
You'll probably learn that coming up.
okay.
That's probably Thursday's class. Okay, so we have the end of the medieval period into the Renaissance. An explosion of knowledge, the Renaissance, 1500 to 1900. Reason and science reigned as the supreme methods of acquiring knowledge. A long list of important thinkers, which includes Bacon, Hobbes, Pascal, Descartes, Leibniz, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, Mill, Rousseau, Kant, Hegel, Schopenhauer. I can repeat it if you want, or you can listen to it, or it's not that important. I can give you a
Was
list.
there 100 years that were nothing? Because you went from 14.
Well, it's not that it wasn't nothing, it's that there wasn't a serious transition yet. Things were just beginning to happen.
So it was from 1500 to what?
Nin-
That was getting in there.
Remember, when you're talking in 400 AD to 1400, there was this clear-cut rejection of the ancient philosophy into the medieval period. And then after the Renaissance period, it's just very simply contemporary. It's a contemporary period. Last 100 years or so.
Martin Luther was in there.
Well, yeah, but he's not considered.
No, a philosopher.
Yes, you had the Reformation. I mean, there was so much happening, right?
Right.
You had the Reformation beginning about the beginning of the Renaissance. Question? Ray? No? Okay, the fourth period is known as contemporary period, probably the most diverse. The most diverse in thinking. So many different schools of thought. We'll get into some of that in the next few weeks.
1900.
Real clear dichotomy between theists and non-theists too. Where in the Renaissance period, some philosophers were motivated because of theism. Many of the scientists were motivated because of their theism, right? A lot of people don't know that. They falsely think that there's a tension between, science and faith, whereas some of the most brilliant minds of that period, or of all time, were conducting their research, their studies, their gathering of knowledge and stuff, as in their own words saying, to the glory of God, right? They assumed that the world operated a certain way, and it was therefore knowable, testable, because it operated by certain laws, and then they attributed those laws to a lawgiver, right? So that was their motivation. Okay, so moving on from the historical approach. A second way to divide philosophy is through examining the different schools of thought. And we're not going to go through all the different schools of thought because they're innumerable. And every philosopher thinks that their nuanced view could be considered its own school of thought. So obviously that wouldn't work. However, there are some very important schools of thought that we'll be looking at, again, as we move forward over the next few weeks. So, probably the easiest way to make this distinction is to categorize two separate schools of thought. Naturalism and then non-naturalism. That's really easy. Naturalism and then non-naturalism. So the first school of thought, naturalism, is the idea that that which exists are simply the parts or the constituents of the natural universe. So naturalism believes that the only things that exist are physical things. I mean, if we reduce things down to their constituents, we're now talking atomic, subatomic, right? Talking about particles there. So, go ahead.
One of the things that is very prevalent in all the colleges today, in that, science is it, that's it. If you can't touch it
Right.
and breathe it and see
Absolutely.
it, it's not real.
Well, that's, yes. There's, you can call it naturalism, materialism, scientism, empiricism, things like that. Those are philosophies, right?
They think
So
it
we'll
is
get
true.
into that. Well, because science is really good at discovering things. It's a great methodology to discover the natural world. But it says nothing at all when it comes to how should I therefore live. Science doesn't tell me anything about whether I should climb over my neighbor's backyard, to steal something from him or not. When we talk about values and things like that. So, yeah, thank God for science, huh?
It just tells facts, not moral, ethical
Right.
Issues.
Right, and that's fantastic. The problem is when we expect too much, right? Or the problem is, no, it wasn't Stephen Jay Gould. Oh, well, I'll think of it later. Anyway, so, talking about naturalism. The most common version of naturalism is scientific naturalism, okay? Which includes two basic ideas. That scientific exploration is the only way to explain reality. This is scientific naturalism. And that the story that explains all of reality, or how everything came to be, is strictly told in terms of event causation, cause and effect. That's all, you're stuck with it. If that's your philosophy, scientific naturalism, then everything has to be explained in terms of event causation and described in terms of the laws of physics and evolutionary biology. Yes?
What would be an example of non-scientific naturalism?
Oh, that's a fantastic question.
Isn't it all kind of scientific or?
Well, not if you go far back, not if you go back prior to the scientific revolution. There were atheists. In fact, if you look at the ancient philosophers who knew nothing of Judaism, they didn't know anything about Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament, and they were throwing off the gods of either the Greek gods or the Roman gods. What were they stuck with? They were stuck with some type of naturalism, and we'll get into that when we're looking at metaphysics. Yes?
What was the question?
Yeah, what was the question?
Oh, darn. An example of non-scientific naturalism. So I don't know anybody that, nobody is well, we're going to get into it, but it'd be difficult to think of somebody today.
One of my science teachers, when I was 8 years old, said that in this world we are not solid matter, that we're atoms and electrons, and that there could be another world living on this earth. That would be non-naturalism, right?
No, I don't think so.
That would be naturalism.
Why would that be naturalism?
I think at the molecular level, like if you had the tools to detect it,
There's space.
there's something, or there's at least the theory that it's there based on some type of.
So air is
What did Hawking,
natural.
what did Hawking believe?
Well, he's a naturalist. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't care if you're talking about, Richard Dawkins or Daniel Dennett or Stephen Hawking. They're scientific naturalists. In fact, it was Hawking who, and this is interesting, but I don't want to get too far sidetracked, but Hawking had come out and said that philosophy was dead, and then all these atheist philosophers just hammered him and said he had no idea what he was talking about. They told him basically to stick to astrophysics, because that's a philosophical statement in itself. To say philosophy's dead is a philosophical statement, therefore it's self-refuting, and therefore he's wrong. So, and that is taking me off topic, but yeah, here's the thing. If you want, I can put together a list of, and again, like I said before, the dichotomy between, science and faith or science and religion or things like that is more manufactured by those involved in the discussion and then therefore misunderstood by the general public. And I see it all the time, like especially on Facebook, you see it all the time. But people don't realize how many physicists, astronomers, cosmologists are actually Bible-believing Christians. So, I mean, I could put a list together if it was that important, but I don't want this class to devolve into scientific discussions. I'm not a scientist, but I do like to read about it, so.
So non-naturalism is more a thought.
Well, we'll talk about that.
Metaphysics.
You're going back to
Yeah.
Patient's question about non-scientific naturalism? We'll talk about it next week. Like I said, all you have to do is go back to the philosophers who weren't theists prior to scientific revolution. Then you'll have it right there. So did you get that, my 2 points? About, what was point 1?
You say that that's the only way to explain reality.
Yes, the scientific explanations or explorations
Cause and
are the
effect.
only adequate way to explain reality. And 2, that the narrative or the story that a scientific naturalist would use to explain all of reality, they would have to do it in terms of event causation, cause and effect. They would have to do it that way. And they would have to do it in terms, because they're limited to the laws of physics and then evolutionary biology. So, the second category, when I said that if we're going to put philosophy into its schools of thought, we gathered up all the schools of thought that weren't non-natural and stuck them right here in naturalism. And then non-naturalism schools of thought are, which you could say supernatural, if you don't want to say non-natural. Although that term supernatural probably is not as good as non-natural, because you have different theistic schools of thought that aren't monotheistic. For instance, here's the most common version.
Believe in many gods.
The most common version: monotheism, Christianity, Judaism, Islam. Deism, which is like monotheism, except that the deistic God is not involved in creation at all. The deistic God is simply transcendent, right? Not immanent. Immanent meaning in or part of or working in the creation, transcendent, outside of. And then you have polytheism. So you had monotheism, deism, polytheism, multiple gods, poly. Pantheism, that God is one with the universe or with creation, and that we're all part of the,
And he's in everything.
yeah. So that pretty much covers it on your natural and non-natural. So that's another way to divide philosophy. But the most customary approach, we're going to take a break here quickly. The most customary approach is to divide philosophy topically, beginning with the broad categories. And we've already done that. We did it in our definition, remember? We call these categories the major branches of philosophy. These major branches have subcategories, and then this is the way we're doing it. We're doing it, dividing it by its branches, its main branches. So let's look at our definition, and then we'll see what time it is there. Here's our definition from last week. And the branches are contained right in that definition. Philosophy is the critical examination of our fundamental beliefs concerning, here's the categories, concerning the nature of reality, there's one, concerning knowledge and truth, there's two, and concerning our moral and social values. There's your three major branches: reality, knowledge, values. Better known in philosophy as metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. So if you need to know, you go back to our definition: nature of reality, knowledge and truth, moral and social values. Those are the major branches of philosophy. Some philosophers throw a fourth, sometimes even a fifth in there. The way we're looking at it, those other categories that were our fourth or fifth are subsumed under metaphysics. So in metaphysics, we have 4 subcategories. Now, if you're taking the final exam, I hope you're taking notes. The 4 subcategories under metaphysics, you have cosmological metaphysics. Cosmological metaphysics is concerned with the origin and purpose or ultimate purpose of reality. Why does anything exist at all? Right? Think about the ancient philosophers who could actually see the stars at night. Why does anything exist at all? Now, when they ask that, they say, look, everything that we're aware of seems to be contingent. There doesn't seem to be anything that necessarily exists. That's what something being contingent is. It's dependent upon something else for its existence. You and I are all contingent beings. Right? We don't necessarily exist. The world would operate just fine, or maybe not fine, but just the way it's operating now, if we didn't happen to be here. Our existence was contingent upon our parents getting together. And theirs likewise, as we regress backwards. There's nothing that you and I can think of that exists in the physical realm that seems to be necessary. So they ask questions like that. So if nothing needs to be here, then why is it here? Where did it come from? When did it start? How did it develop into the way that it is now? Is there a purpose? What about time? Did time begin or is it eternal? Is anything necessary? So questions like that, subsumed under cosmological metaphysics. Theistic metaphysics, questions about God. This is category 2.
What is it?
Theistic. Is there a God? Do we have reasons to think so? I mean, if the statement God exists is a truth claim, then you'd want to have some reasons for arguing that way. If there is a God, what is he like? Is he personal or is he impersonal? What about his attributes? What is omniscience? What is omnipotence? What is omnibenevolence? Right? What is omnipresent? What does eternal mean? Immutable mean? Infinite mean? Transcendent mean? Immanent mean? Those types of attributes. Those are questions. And how is God related to the rest of reality? Sort of touched on that, right, when we talked about monotheism and transcendence, etc. How does God relate to the rest of reality? In what ways does he sustain it? Does he intervene? Is he accessible? Does he reveal himself? What about miracles? Did God create everything? If so, does that mean he created evil? Those are questions under theistic metaphysics. Our third subcategory under metaphysics is anthropological metaphysics. This is a category that some people put right up next to metaphysics, epistemology, anthropology, ethics. Anthropology, the study of man, study of human beings. What is the nature of a human being? Is he more than just the physical? What about consciousness? Does he have a soul? What about his thoughts? Are they material? Non-physical events cause physical responses. That would be a second question, depending upon how you answer. Is he simply physical? What about free will? If he's not only physical, is there such thing as free will? Or because of contingencies, cause and effect. Remember the definition of scientific naturalism. You have to explain everything in terms of cause and effect. How could man have free will if everything can be explained in terms of cause and effect? That's anthropological metaphysics. Our fourth category would be ontological metaphysics, probably the one that asks the questions that we think of.
How you spell it?
ontological.
Can't believe it's so.
Ontological metaphysics. It's the most basic category. What is the nature of existence? You know, it's probably, I guess it's the most abstract category. What does it all mean? Are we in a matrix? Yeah, it has to, ontological has to do with the nature of being, the nature of existence. And so, is reality singular or plural? And this goes back to our anthropology too. So if we answered the questions about man, what type of being is he? If you were a monist, or if you believed in monism, or that all of reality is a singular or one, you couldn't say that man was dualistic. You couldn't say that man was physical and non-physical. You'd have to say he was only physical. So monism or pluralism? Is reality one or more than one? Is it made up, right? Natural versus natural and supernatural. Or physicalism. So we will look at the divisions of ontological metaphysics more as we read this next chapter on metaphysics. Because you're talking about that now we're going back to ancient philosophy. Now we're going back to Plato, right? Properties, substances, universals, particulars. This might be the hardest part to grasp. Is it's bad? Diane said it's bad. She already read it. It's bad. Paul, is it bad? No, it's not.
No, it's good. It's good.
Okay.
Bad good. No.
All right, we're going to take a break. So, we just got done with only one of the three branches,
Yep.
right?
Which one?
Now, I won't spend, well, we talked about metaphysics, right?
Right.
We read our definition, and from our definition, we talked about critically examining our foundational beliefs concerning what? The nature of reality. Boom. That's branch number one, metaphysics, the nature of reality. We had the four subcategories, right? The anthropological, the cosmological, the ontological, right, and the theistic metaphysics. So what are our next two remaining branches? Epistemology and ethics. So epistemology deals with knowledge, truth claims. It deals with the methods that we use to gather knowledge. It deals with validity. It deals with the scope. Okay? Done. We're done with epistemology until we get to it in the book.
And again, method that we use to gather knowledge.
Yeah, epistemology is the study of knowledge. How do we know things? How do we know that we know things? What are the methods for knowing things? Okay? So it deals with truth claims. And then our third category we said is ethics. Sometimes it's called axiology. So A-X-I-O-L-O-G-Y, which is the study of values. No, I'm not. No, I didn't. I'm just throwing it out there.
Let me ask you a half hour from now, is there going to be a new word for it?
No. A-X-I-O-L-O-G-Y, the study of values.
Theology, never heard of that.
Study of values. Or
I'm
things
getting-
of
I'm
value.
getting punch drunk.
Here's the thing. Everybody ascribes value to something. Whether it's their own life, some material possession, another person, something. Everybody ascribes value to something. So those are our three categories.
Okay, can I ask you one thing? Don't throw a rock at me.
I'm not.
Metaphysics is under what category again? 'Cause I somehow
It's the main branch.
That's the main branch.
There's
or-
three main branches. Metaphysics is probably the main of the main.
And then everything under that.
It's just the way I typed it. I got a tree going.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to organize this.
Metaphysics is the study of basically reality,
Okay.
beyond reality, ultimate reality.
Okay.
Okay? Do you feel better? Says the
Go back and watch
three
it.
branches. Read our definition.
Yeah.
There's our three branches right there.
It's on page 28.
Yeah.
Oh, let me type it. Page what?
28.
Oh, there we go. Next.
Okay. Let's talk about logic. Now, some of you had the critical thinking class that was a year ago.
Yeah, I'm not a critical thinker.
And well, you are. So the rest of our evening will cover some familiar terrain.
Yep.
And if you didn't have that class, that's okay,
I did recognize something.
because well, you have to cover it again anyways. And so if you didn't have the class and you're covering it for the first time, that's okay. We'll help you get through it. And the thing about logic, it's important and it's necessary because it's crucial to constructing and evaluating arguments.
I had to read chapter 1 3 times.
You read chapter 1 3 times?
I think I'm going to read it a 4th.
That's fine. That's good.
Because I just don't have trouble.
So, the laws of logic.
It's crucial because that's easier than chapter 2.
Logic is crucial because the study of logic is necessary for the ability to evaluate and construct arguments.
Wait, say that. I'm
We
sorry.
don't want to reason improperly. We don't want to make mistakes in our the way we come to conclusions. So we're going to see all that. So we're going to first talk about, our book calls them the laws of thought. 3 laws of thought. Around 14 or 13 page, somewhere around there. 13.
Page 13?
They're known as the laws of thought, or they're known as the laws of logic.
Yeah. Okay. Yep.
In either case, they are first principles. A first principle is a basic foundational proposition that cannot be deduced from any other truth. It cannot be deduced from any other starting point. That's why it's called a first principle. It needs no argument for it.
You need to say that again.
The laws of thought are first principles. A first principle is a basic, foundational proposition that cannot be deduced from any other truth. It cannot be deduced from any other starting point. You can't get more foundational than the laws of thought, than the laws of logic.
See, that's in the book, and I read that multiple times, and that doesn't even ring a bell.
Said a little bit differently, but it is.
It's pretty close, though?
Okay?
Wow. I'm getting...
Yeah, a first principle doesn't need to be defended, because to argue against a first principle is to use the first principle in your argument against it, which is self-refuting. And we'll see how that happens to work. The laws themselves are self-evident truths. You can't escape them. They're self-evident truths. They're simply the way things work. They make thinking and discourse possible. If they aren't recognized as true, then we can't claim anything to be true. So, you think they're important to know? You think they're important to understand? Absolutely. So I use a little different order than the book, but our first law of thought, or our first law of logic, probably primary, you can't really say primary in importance, because they're all important and they each entail the other. So if you accept one, you do have to accept the others. It sort of goes that way. But I put number 1 as the law of non-contradiction. the law of non-contradiction. And here is a definition of it. The law of non-contradiction says that something or anything cannot both be and not be at the same time and in the same regard or in the same respect. Something, anything, plug in something, this bottle of water cannot both be, exist, and not be, not exist at the same time.
It's like it can't be true and false.
It can't be true and
One or
false.
the other.
That's the law of excluded middle. That's our next law.
Oh, bummer.
So, if you want to, logicians use symbols too. So, I may bring in a sheet next week that has symbols. I don't want that to confuse you. You don't need it if you're not pursuing a career in logic as a logician. Then you don't need to know symbolic logic. But logicians use symbols to write it instead of using words to write it all out. So basically it's a simple way to think of it, and this is not even proper symbols. If you do X, you write this down, X, put the equal sign with a line through it. X does not equal not X or non-X. That's the law of non-contradiction. We can't even think without these laws, because when we think, we're identifying things, right? We're identifying terms and concepts, etc. So they have to mean something. When we talk, our words have to mean something. You have to understand the words I'm speaking to be able to communicate with me. So the law of non-contradiction, as you can see, is a first principle. It's foundational.
These are laws, but are there any exceptions to some of these?
No,
That one, no.
there's no way that there can be an exception. So you guys got that. Something cannot both be and not be at the same time in the same respect.
That's the law of non-contradiction.
The law of non-contradiction. There is never an exception to this law. In fact, this is fantastic. This is like one of my all-time favorite quotes. A medieval philosopher who had grown tired, he'd either grown tired of disputing over the laws of logic, or he had grown tired of reading about the pre-Socratics and the Socratics, Socrates, etc., Aristotle. By the way, these are attributed to Aristotle. So if you hear someone say Aristotelian logic, Aristotle's logic, it's simply that he formulated them. He didn't come up with them. That'd be like saying Newton came up with gravity, and before Newton was there was no gravity. No. The laws of thought, the laws of logic were there. It was Aristotle who formulated them, right? So, a medieval philosopher, grown tired or weary of disputing the laws of logic, had this to say. He said, anyone who denies the law of non-contradiction, none of you better deny it, should be beaten and burned
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
until he admits that to be beaten is not the same as not to be beaten. And to be burned is not the same as not to be burned. That would handle it. Oh, you don't subscribe to the law of non-contradiction? You beat him. Is that the same as to not be beaten?
Is that what the X does not equal non-X? Is that for that law? Or
Yes, that is the law of non-contradiction. Something can't be X.
I thought it was like extended.
Something cannot be X. No, that's a little bit different. Something can't be X and not X at the same time in the same regard. So if X is anything, non-X is everything else in the universe. Every single atom that isn't part of X. So if X is this paper clip, not X is everything else in the universe.
Is that the way colors work? I thought I heard it explained one time that's what color is. Like green is the absence actually of everything but green.
Well, I'm not sure about that, only because how light refracts and you get colors and it's wavelengths, it's the absence of certain wavelengths or particles or whatever that happens to be. But I do know what you're saying. Like he did say that. I think therefore I am. Sometimes Christians get squeamish when we say, okay, this law is inviolable. You can't violate this law. And so someone says, well, what about God? Can't God violate the law of non-contradiction? I mean, we say that he's all-powerful, right? Omnipotent or all-powerful. Square. Definitionally, a square is one thing, right? A quadrilateral with 4 equal sides, 90 degrees, right? A circle is something else. A point whose radius is equidistant, whatever. If I remember my geometry correctly. So you can't have a round square. There's no such thing. God also cannot be and not be at the same time. How could God go out of existence? He can't do that. He can't lie.
Always exists.
He can't create a being greater than himself. So it doesn't detract from his omnipotence to point out the things that he can't do. Because a God that could do those things is capricious and arbitrary and unworthy to just be able to violate his own nature. So you say, where do the laws of logic come from? The laws of logic are immaterial, invariant, and universal.
But those,
Where do you think they came from?
but Joe, isn't there the laws of logic that are in our time, space, and matter, in our reality? But he transcends that. So he doesn't. The laws that we're talking about, he doesn't.
Okay, well, you're thinking of law, it's like a physical law.
Well,
These aren't physical laws, right? That's why in the book they call them laws of thought.
Okay.
If the universe is a product of who God is, then the laws of logic also reflect that, what type of being he is.
Yeah, you're talking about laws of thought. Okay.
So you said they were immaterial what?
Invariant and universal.
So basically, it's like
They apply everywhere in the universe. I'm sorry, go ahead, Bill.
God can't be evil and good.
Well, no, not,
He can't be evil.
well, not our conception, not the God of the Bible, not Yahweh, right? We've talked about in other classes the Euthyphro dilemma. The Euthyphro dilemma touches on that particular issue you're talking about.
That doesn't answer the two questions. It presents a third question, or a third proposition, right? The dilemma. It doesn't.
The horns of the dilemma are,
Right.
does God love that which is good because it's good? Or is that or is it good because God loves it?
But then it gives you a third.
One response, to answer one of them means that goodness resides outside of God,
Right.
and he's drawn to it. The other one is that it's only good because God decided it, and tomorrow he could decide something else is good. The answer to the dilemma is that goodness is a reflection of his character, and because it's a reflection of his character, it doesn't change.
So it gives you a third alternative. It doesn't trap itself in the first two.
No, it's a false dilemma.
Yeah, it's a false dilemma, okay, yeah.
So, anyways,
But can I just, not to go down a side hole, but Jesus being able to sin is kind of a different question.
No,
In a sense that he was still 100% man, 100% God, but that would be a different theological question in itself, because he still was tempted.
well, that is a question that is debated
Right,
in theological circles.
right. Because it would be
And-
temptation if he wasn't
yeah.
able to sin, right?
Well, that's what some people say.
Okay.
So it's not true temptation if he's really not capable or able.
Right.
That the only thing that makes it temptation worthy of overcoming is that it was possible
Well, yeah,
that he
if I
could
go-
have fallen.
If I go home to my wife
Um,
right now and say, I'm tempted to go buy that airplane in Orange County Airport, that's not really a temptation because I can't do it.
Or I'll tell you,
No, hey, look, I know, I get the two sides.
Yeah,
I don't want to go down that road
Yeah, I know.
right at this point.
I know.
We have so much to cover.
I understand.
But those are issues that are debated.
Yeah, okay.
That theologians debate that.
do is talk about
Well,
philosophy.
we are.
Philosophize.
We are. Diane wants to have that discussion.
This isn't a 4-hour class, Diane.
I know. That's why 1 hour is not enough. 2 hours.
Write those questions down, and maybe there's a.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go.
So,
Law of
all right. So I think I won't say that I exhausted that, but I covered that. Okay. The law of non-contradiction, and what does it mean to say that there's things that God can't do? Is it a detraction from his omnipotence? No, it's not.
Character.
It's not a detraction at all.
Now it's the law of excluded middle, right?
Uh-huh.
That's chapter 1.
Yep. Second law is the law of excluded middle. Something either is or is not. Now don't confuse this and say, well, what about areas that are gray? That's not what we're talking about. We're saying something is either X or it's non-X. Okay, we had the X does not equal non-X. Now it's X or non-X. So replace the not equal sign with an or. X or non-X. It's one or the other. It's one or the other. Paul Hicks is at Truth Academy at this moment, or he is not. It's one or the other. Can't be both. He could be doing 10 million other things, which is in the category of not being at Truth Academy, or he's at Truth Academy. You could say the same thing about every person on planet Earth. They're either in Truth Academy right now, or they're not. And obviously the majority of people are not.
How about if we're here, but we're really not?
Well, Richard, what would be new? No, okay. Touche. I'm just kidding. That was good. So, do you get the law of excluded middle?
Yeah.
We're excluding the middle. That's not an option. Either or not. There's nothing in between. There's either, water in this bottle, or there's not water in this bottle. It can't be both. There's either water in this bottle, or there's not water in this bottle. Third law of thought is the law of identity. Simply says X equals X. Something is what it is. This is the most obvious of the three. The law of identity. Whatever a particular thing is, it is that particular thing. X equals X.
God is who he is.
Yep.
Can't turn it into
Now, that doesn't mean, we can have different terms that refer to the same thing, right? We could say that the senior pastor of Living Truth is not in class tonight, but he was last week. Or we could say Michael Lance is not in class tonight, but he was last week, referring to the same person, because the two different references point to the same individual. So as I said before, these three laws entail each other. If one is true, then so are the other two. Okay, so we've been expressing these laws in terms that have to do with existence, but they are used most practically when we express them in regards to propositions. Okay? Propositions are statements that are either true or false. A proposition is simply a sentence that is either true or false. So this is what brings out their usefulness when we construct arguments or evaluate arguments, when we apply them about the truthfulness of a proposition. So, for example, for the law of non-contradiction, we could say a proposition cannot be both true and false at the same time in the same respect. And I use an example with Paul here. Paul Hicks is attending the philosophy class on Tuesday nights from 7 to 9 at Living Truth Christian Fellowship, or he is not. So that's a proposition expressing the law of non-contradiction. How about the law of excluded middle?
I thought that was excluded.
Yeah, I did too.
Excuse me?
That was
I
law
thought
of
that one was excluded.
excluded middle.
Because X or non-X, I thought.
Because something either
A
is.
proposition cannot be both true and false at the same time in the same respect.
That's
That's
the law of excluded middle.
That's non-contradictory.
no, excluded middle is either true or false.
It says.
X or X does not equal non-X. It can't be both. Okay, here's law of excluded middle. A proposition is either true or false.
Okay.
It's the or.
Okay.
It's the or. One or the other. True or false. And the law of identity is all true propositions are true and all false propositions are false.
All true.
Is there an X equation for law of identity?
X equals X.
X does not equal.
That's a good thing you points out about Isaiah 45:5. He uses to,
Isaiah 45:5.
I'm the Lord.
that he describes about God
Yeah.
to verify these laws.
Is what it is.
Isaiah 45:5. I am the Lord and there is no other. Okay. Besides me, there is no God. So you have identity, you have excluded middle, and non-contradiction. I am the Lord, there is no other. Besides me, there is no God.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah, it is.
You're going to give us a bunch of verses to make all 3 points.
Well, I could do that.
I don't know. That's okay. I'm just.
So to reiterate, the laws of logic are not in any need of proof beyond themselves. They are evident. They prove themselves and therefore need no proof beyond that. If anyone tries to deny them, they will be beaten or burned. No. If anyone tries to deny them, they will be using a self-defeating argument. You can't try to deny them without using them. What's a self-defeating argument? To say there is no truth. That's a self-defeating argument. Is that statement true?
No.
Right? You're saying, you're making a claim that's supposed to be true, but you're saying there is no truth. That's a self-defeating argument. So we've said that philosophy is thinking critically about our beliefs. So our use of logic then should be seen as helping us to critically think about our thinking critically. Yes. Helps us critically think when we think critically. You can write it any way you want.
Did you make that up as you went?
I like it.
I know I've read something similar. You could say it however you want. Logic
But people can
helps
in
us-
denial.
helps
I know
us
that. I see it daily.
Helps us.
in your practice,
They deny
in your
it
counseling practice.
all the time.
All right.
So now we're going to begin using the language that logicians use. Okay? So we're going to set the laws of thought aside and then start talking about arguments, propositions, premises, conclusions, validity, soundness, deductive, inductive, etc., etc. Do we have any questions?
How do you pronounce
Cogency.
this? There you go. See,
Cogency deals with inductive arguments.
but it's kind of gray area stuff there. So these
Well,
are all-
inductive arguments aren't deductive. Therefore,
Okay.
you're not looking for validity and soundness. You're looking for strength and probability.
Okay. That's right. I'm sorry. I do remember that now.
And cogency is person relative. It's like
Right, that's what I'm
subjective.
saying. Yeah, subjective.
So an argument could be really cogent for me. It really makes sense.
Because you
I
believe
buy
it.
into it,
Right.
and you're like,
I can't help
Because you already have a bias for it.
and if it's not deductive, then there's room for that.
Right. Okay. That's
Now, a good deductive argument should eliminate
yeah.
that. It doesn't always.
Because that's a sound.
It doesn't always,
But it should.
because a person can reject a deductive argument without knowing exactly which premise they believe could be undermined, even if they can't themselves at this moment undermine one of the premises.
Just one of the premises would be enough.
They could still not buy into the argument and say, I don't believe that, but I just can't argue against it at the moment. So, any other questions as we do this? So there will be some, it's almost like the terminology. You want to write down the definitions?
Yes, we need them in front of us, so we can, like,
Okay, so before we do that, or as we do that, I want to talk about, very briefly, the 3 acts of the mind. This is not in your book.
is it gonna be on the test?
Probably not. We covered this in critical thinking, the 3 acts of the mind, and that'll take us into looking at arguments. Okay, so the 3 acts of mind So not, the first act of our minds is to apprehend. Okay? So we apprehend things when we're little. This is even before we know what to call things, right? So the first act of mind is apprehension, which in turn leads to concepts or terms. So apprehension leading to terms or concepts. That's our verbal expression. So the mental part is to apprehend. The verbal part, you could say written part, okay, expressing it, is to attach a term to it. It's what we call things. What's that? That's a woman or whatever, right? The second act, so the first act, grasp. The second act, we say judges. It puts terms together. It's how we form propositions. So it takes more than one term and joins them. We say that either unites terms. Joe is wearing black high tops. Okay? That I just joined two terms. Joe and high tops. Or it divides. So terms are united or divided. Joe is not wearing dress shoes. I separated Joe from dress shoes. So the first act of mind is to grasp, apprehend. It becomes terms or concepts. The second act is called judging, which unites terms or divides terms, resulting in a proposition that's either true or false. That's the key. It results in propositions, which are sentences. They're true or false. You know, not all sentences are propositions. You have exclamations, like, oh wow, that's a sentence. You have questions. A question is a sentence, but it's not a proposition. It's not a true or false, right? So propositions are particular types of sentences. They're true or false. And the third act is reasoning. We reason by inference. Our reasoning becomes an argument. We're putting propositions together to make an argument. So the true or false proposition becomes part of an argument. That's how we draw conclusions. That's how we come to hold beliefs. We grasp things, becomes terms. Terms become true or false statements. Yeah. True or false statements are combined into arguments which become beliefs. They become our beliefs. Yeah, absolutely. Spoken or unspoken. We do it all the time. We don't even think about it. We don't even think about it. Okay, so here are some definitions. You know what? It's 8:53. Well, there's no way I'm going to get through all these. Okay, what's a proposition? It's a sentence. It's a statement that affirms or denies something and has truth value. That's a preposition.
Statement that says that's right.
You said it's dangling?
Can you go to this one more time, Joe? I'm sorry.
Okay, a proposition is a statement that affirms or denies something. It has truth value. You can say it's true or false. That's what it means to say something has truth value. You're making a statement about whether it's true or false.
That's the middle identity.
So it can be affirmed or denied.
Excluded middle.
Questions, commands, and exclamation points are sentences, but they're not propositions. Proposition is a statement that has truth value. What are arguments? Arguments are inferences which can be drawn from one or more propositions. A proposition has truth value, another proposition has truth value, another proposition has truth value. Is there a conclusion that can be drawn from those three, or two, or one of them? Are they not related? But an argument relies on what those propositions infer. So when we look at arguments, it'll help. Here, you can write this down. This will help. Write down this. All men are mortal. This is like the most basic syllogism. It's been used for forever. All men are Socrates was a human. Therefore, Socrates was mortal. There's an argument. There's three propositions there. There's three statements, three sentences that have truth value. Right? All men or all humans are mortal. That's one proposition. Socrates was a human. That's the second proposition. And the third one, what we can infer from the first two propositions is that Socrates is therefore mortal. That's a very basic argument. So arguments attempt to demonstrate that something is true. Explanations attempt to show how something is true. Arguments are an attempt to show how something is true. So you're going to keep that little syllogism there. The syllogism is a argument that has two premises and one conclusion. Okay, there's three statements or three propositions. Two of them are the premises. The conclusion is what is inferred from the two. Okay, that's a deductive argument. A deductive argument. So deductive reasoning moves from the general, or what is usually accepted as true. So it moves from the general to the specific. And so if you go back and look at our syllogism, you can see how that's. All men are mortal. That's general. So it's moving towards something specific. Socrates was a man. Therefore, Socrates was mortal. So you have a broad category, all men, to a category of one. That's a deductive argument, from general to specific. Now, the interesting thing about deductive arguments is that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true.
Yeah, those are sound arguments.
It's valid, and we'll talk about validity and soundness and the strengths and things like that next week.
Are you going to get into the fallacies and informal fallacies?
I have to do a little bit of that. I'm not going to do a lot.
Okay.
We need to get to the metaphysics. We need to get to the categories. We want to talk about the philosophers, particular schools of thought, and things like that. I don't want to rehash the critical thinking class. You know, we had the square of opposition, right? We had all SSP, no SSP. Those are universals. We had particulars. We have major and minor premises, middle terms. We have all this other stuff. So I don't want to.
Did you enjoy
Anybody?
this stuff in college?
Yeah, no, I did. When I took my first philosophy class. Again, it was in college,
Right.
and it was
I have a name for it.
it was a class on miracles actually.
Wow.
And the professor, we read some C.S. Lewis, Nietzsche, David Hume. The professor did a pretty good job of removing his biases, but he told me after the semester that he was an atheist.
Oh, wow.
But he did a pretty good job. He was pretty fair. And, you know, I went to a secular university, so I mean, I didn't expect one way or the other. It didn't matter to me. And even at that time, I was on the fence. I wasn't. I was searching, I would say. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. So, but yeah, I've always. I mean, everybody does philosophy. Every kid does. When kids ask questions, what is that? Why is that? How come? How far? What's on the other side? Can you see? Are we there yet?
Yeah. Are we done yet? There we go. Are we done yet?
All right. Wow. I always feel worn out when I'm after class.
Well, you pick the tough classes to teach.
Joe takes the hard ones.
Well, we have.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to teach some of the other ones too. That'd be fun, but you know, there's only so much time.
Why don't you
I like
have
taking a break in between quarters.
2 classes a week?
Well, that would be hard. 2 classes a week. Pastor John,
Yeah, how would you do it?
we're going to leave. You want to ask for a blessing?
Sure. Lord, we just want to again come before you and thank you for this time, Lord. We thank you for Joe, Lord, and his knowledge, his insight, and his wisdom, Lord, and trying to instruct us, Lord. And these topics, Lord, just seem to be heavy at times, but Lord, they're really important for our Christian walk, and we just thank you for that. We thank you for everyone being here. We ask for traveling mercies home, Lord, until we can come together again, Lord. We ask that you would just bless our time, bless our families. Keep us safe, Lord, in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Good job, Joe.
Thanks, brother.